China has reported just one new case of coronavirus and no deaths. The figures marking 3 weeks, in fact, since it recorded a COVID-19 fatality. That, as the World Health Organization says, Washington has provided no evidence to support claims, including from the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the weekend, that there is enormous evidence, as he put it, that the virus emerged from a laboratory in Wuhan. Well, we're going to talk now to Rana Mitter. He's director of the University of Oxford's China Centre and professor of the history of modern China. Thanks for being with us on the programme. So China's state broadcasters really hit out, hasn't it, at Mike Pompeo's comments, calling them insane and invasive. In the relationship between the US and China, in real trouble again here, would you say?
Let's be honest, Stuart, it's not in the best state that it's ever been, and this kind of language clearly doesn't help. On the other hand, it's fair to say that the situation in terms of a really bad relationship between the US and China rhetorically has been going on for some time. So in some ways, the COVID situation has exacerbated what was happening already, rather than being something completely new.
And presumably you would say that Donald Trump's administration has obvious reasons for trying to pin the blame, shift the blame off of them and pin it on someone else, China the obvious candidate, perhaps.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that because at the moment President Trump is most concerned with getting re-elected, it's very important that he turns attention away from domestic death rates, which you just reported in your previous item, and instead talk about China. But it's also worth noting there are things happening under the surface that are perhaps a little bit less extreme. For instance, the trade agreement, which was finally hammered out just before Christmas between the US and China, that hasn't actually been abandoned yet. And there is a feeling that there are some people in the US administration, particularly Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and figures like Liu He, a top Chinese leader, who are being sent to try and have a slightly more moderate conversation underneath the rhetoric.
Yeah, so using that lever perhaps to try and get their own way a little bit more. Let's be honest, though, on the other hand, China can't just get away with it scot-free, if you like. There are questions to answer, aren't there?
Oh, there absolutely are. This very aggressive language that's being used is nicknamed in China itself wolf warrior diplomacy, named after a big action movie of about 3 or 4 years ago, in which Chinese diplomats were essentially rather more like James Bond than they were sleek ambassadors. But it hides a certain unwillingness to talk about the fact that there were things that were done in Wuhan, the city where the outbreak first came, that were not reported to the authorities at the highest levels because the officials in China were simply too frightened to tell their superiors what was actually happening. And the lack of transparency in the system is something that still is very much the case today. Until that's dealt with, it is entirely possible that that unwillingness to give the full, frank facts and information will continue to hamper China's ability to be believed when it says that it really isn't having any new cases or a resurgence of the virus.
So you don't believe those figures?
I think that it does seem likely that the virus is being restrained in China. The reason being that we can look at other things, for instance, the level of return to schools, to subway systems, metros and so forth. Frankly, even the Chinese authorities, which like to hide unfortunate information, I think would not be opening the lockdown if they were thought they were about to kill large numbers of their own people. It would cause a backlash. But in terms of the specific numbers, I think we just don't have enough information yet. And the distraction activities from the United States president, which are real, shouldn't distract us from the other fact, which is that China hasn't yet agreed to any kind of neutral, objective, scientific investigation being carried out by people outside China to help get the real facts about what's going on. That would probably be the single biggest and most helpful diplomatic move they could make. And I suspect it would actually get a lot of goodwill for China, even though they feel a bit nervous about doing it. But right now, they're saying no.
And if the figures, they might not be entirely accurate, but let's face it, it does seem that the number of cases and the number of deaths has gone down enormously. How do you think China's been able to do that where other countries have perhaps not been so successful?
Well, some of the tactics are ones that a democratic society, France, Britain, the US, simply couldn't use, or would find it much harder to use, like shutting down an entire city with military patrols, cutting off all public transport, basically making it almost impossible for anyone at all to come in and out of a city of around 10 or 11 million people. But other tactics are things that are perhaps being used more elsewhere, tracing applications through people's mobile phones, and also, of course, relentless information and propaganda, you might say, in the Chinese context, telling people how to behave and not to behave in ways that might spread the virus, along with the use of things such as electronic commerce to get food to people's houses without human beings being involved. It's not all good, it's not all bad in that particular sense, but it is different from what a democratic society would do. And while we can learn from China, we also have to be much more careful in the liberal world to preserve our own civil liberties in a way that the Chinese Communist Party really wouldn't care to do.
Rana Mitter, thanks very much for being with us on the programme. That's Rana Mitter there from the University of Oxford's China Centre.